Well, good afternoon. My name is Paulo Sotero. I am the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. I would like to welcome you this afternoon here for this session on what we think is a very timely topic, Brazil in regional and global history. I'd like to recognize Cindy Arnson, the director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center. And actually we are receiving a return visit for a very dear friend, Alan Wright, who for a couple of years was the program assistant at the Wilson Center, at the Brazil Institute. So very glad to see him here and to see other friends. We have with us a few scholars from the Wilson Center and Embajador Carlos Portales from Chile, now a professor at American University. We are going to hear today from two very dear friends of the Brazil Institute. Actually, they are part of the Brazil Institute as members of our advisory council, and Leslie Bethel as also a scholar in residence here. You have their bios. I wanted to, and I'm not going to read it because you probably know who they are. Ambassador Luigi Einaudi, who was U.S. Ambassador to the Organization of American States, was also Deputy Secretary General of the United States, and that has participated in missions that were very relevant to the topic that we are debating here in terms of Brazil's role in regional and global affairs. He has recently finished an article on Brazil and the United States, very timely on the eve of President Obama's trip to Brazil, Chile, and El Salvador. And you can have copies there. The article emphasizes the need for engagement between those two countries that are today the largest economies and the largest democracies in this hemisphere, in this continent. Leslie Bethel, a leading historian of Brazil from England. He was for many years a professor at University of London, later Oxford University. Today he lives in Rio de Janeiro, where he runs a program at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. This topic is of immense relevance, the topic of Brazil in regional and global affairs, a historic perspective on that, because for people that are not Brazilian, and have not studied Brazil, it may be quite surprising that all of a sudden Brazil appears in the global scene as an actor. For Brazilians, and especially for Brazilians that have studied and reflected about Brazil's history, it's not new at all. I will read to you something that was written by the first Brazilian full ambassador to Washington, a historian, a statesman, one of the great intellectuals of Brazil, Joaquim Nabuco, from the state of Pernambuco, and who was actually a very close friend of Elijah Root, the first Secretary of State of the United States, later a Nobel Peace Prize, who was the first Secretary of State of the United States to travel abroad in an official mission, and he went to Brazil in 1906. The phrase is from 1908, and Joaquim Nabuco says, "Brazil has always been conscious of its size and has been governed by a prophetic sentiment with regards to its future." I would invite Professor Leslie Bethel to offer us his reflections on this precise topic, of Brazil, thinking of itself historically as a country that has our own version of manifest destiny. And then later, we will hear from Ambassador Einaudi. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by saying that the Woodrow Wilson Center must be one of the best places in the world in which to research, think, and write about contemporary international history and politics and international relations. And since I retired from Oxford and went to live in Rio de Janeiro 3 years ago, I've been privileged to have been appointed a senior scholar of the Center's Latin American Program and Brazil Institute, and I've spent 3 successive periods of 2 to 3 months here as a public policy scholar, which I'm not really, but I pretend to be a public policy scholar when I'm here. And I'm grateful to Paulo Sotero and Cindy Arnson and, of course, Mike Van Dusen for making this possible. As I said in my 5 minutes of fame, every visitor to the center gets 5 minutes to explain who they are and what they think they're doing. And I said that I have 2 relatively frivolous projects. One is a study of what foreign intellectuals, writers, artists, resident and visiting Brazil in the 19th and 20th centuries contributed to our understanding and knowledge of Brazil. And the other is a history of opera in Brazil. But my serious project, and therefore the one that I do here, of course, this is a very serious place, the serious project is a book on Brazil in regional and global history since independence in 1822. And I've researched it by theme: Brazil and Europe, especially Brazil and Britain, Brazil and Spanish America, Brazil and the United States. I've written quite a bit on Brazil and Great Britain, and last year I completed a piece on Brazil and Spanish America. And this year I've been looking much more at Brazil and the United States, from the First Republic to the Cold War. But I'll write this book chronologically, of course: Empire, First Republic, Vargas period, Cold War, post-Cold War. And I've just finished the chapter on Brazil in the world during the Empire, which will be published by a Spanish foundation later this year. Paulo Sotero and I originally had an idea of a one-day conference looking at this, the whole topic, Brazil in regional and global history. We may still do this, but I was finally asked to fly solo today, with Ambassador Einaudi making some comments. 2 broad generalizations to start with. For almost 200 years, as Paulo has already hinted, Brazilian politicians and Brazilian intellectuals have always viewed, or to be more precise, there have been several periods in which Brazilian politicians and intellectuals have viewed Brazil as destined to become a great nation, and one that would play a major and positive role in international affairs. That was true at independence. Brazil became an empire, not a monarchy. It was true in the late empire, when Brazil compared itself favorably with the Spanish American republics. It was true during the Second World War and immediately after. It was true during the military, during the period of the economic miracle in the 70s. And of course, most recently, Lula himself has taken on the task of declaring Brazil's greatness. I quote from an article that Paulo Sotero published recently: Brazil is the region's natural leader. We are ready to assume its greatness. This is in his first year as president. This country has greatness. This country has everything to become an equal of any other country in the world. And the outside world has tended to reinforce this view. I can think of 30, 40, 50 books by outsiders who have recognized Brazil's potential for greatness. The most famous, of course, was Stefan Zweig. Stefan Zweig, Brasil, País do Futuro, Brazil, Land of the Future. We might like to note that it was published first in Stockholm in German, and the title was Brazil, a Land of the Future. And in the Portuguese and the English edition, the A was dropped. And it's no good saying that Stefan Zweig was manipulated by his translators or publishers. Stefan Zweig knew exactly what was happening. And by dropping the A, it implied Brazil, the land of the future. There are several reasons for this belief in Brazil's great future. Very quickly, as most of you know, the argument would be continental size. Brazil's territory and political unity has never been seriously challenged, at least since the 1830s. And indeed, Brazil is one of the few states of its size in the world with unchallenged sovereign territory and unity. Secondly, immense natural resources, agricultural and mineral, and now, of course, oil. Thirdly, the size and diversity of its population, an interesting mix of indigenous, Portuguese, African, Italian, later Japanese, and since the 1940s, an enormous population growth from 30 million to what is now almost 200 million. Fourthly, the unique social and cultural homogeneity. There are no significant linguistic, racial, ethnic, religious, regional divisions and conflicts in Brazil. Some would dispute racial. Some would insist that there are racial divisions and conflicts. But in general, no country of Brazil's size is as homogeneous as this. And finally, Brazil has been a peaceful nation since the Paraguayan War in the middle of the 19th century. Brazil has no enemies, and Brazil is extremely skilled in diplomacy, negotiation, has shown respect for international norms and treaties. In other words, plenty of soft power. Of course, very little hard power. Brazil must be the weakest in terms of its armed forces of any of the major countries in the world. Certainly countries of its size, population, wealth, Brazil is probably the weakest in military terms. The second broad generalization would be that Brazil has been relatively peripheral in regional affairs. Now, immediately we have a problem. What do we mean by the region? What is Brazil's region? Is it the Western Hemisphere? Is it Latin America? Or is it South America? But whichever, Brazil has been relatively peripheral in regional affairs, except, and an important exception, except in the Rio de la Plata. In the Rio de la Plata, Brazil fought 3 wars in the 19th century, had a long-standing rivalry with the other leading country of South America, Argentina. And Brazil has been even more peripheral in world affairs. In other words, punching well below its weight in both regional and global affairs until the last 10 to 15 years. And the reasons are obvious. Brazil has been largely inward-looking, interested in its state building, political institutions, how to govern this huge and until relatively recently largely underpopulated country, its own economic and social development, and since the 1920s, the long struggle to define a national identity. This has changed since the mid-90s. It's an extraordinary change. Brazil is now active, engaged, increasingly influential in both regional and the world at large. So the question is, why did Brazil punch so much below its weight until recently? And if this is true, the role that Brazil now plays, and some would say, if anything, it's now punching above its weight, maybe punching above its weight. What has happened? And what role does Brazil want to play in regional and global affairs? This is no doubt what we'll end up discussing for the most part. But my task now is to provide some historical perspective on this broad situation. Let's look briefly then at how, since independence, Brazilian politicians and intellectuals have thought about Brazil in the region and in the world, and how Brazilian governments have acted in relation to the region and the rest of the world. And if we start with the empire, one has to begin by saying that Brazilian intellectuals and politicians, Brazilian governments and Brazilian thinkers saw Brazil as part of the Atlantic world, as it had been for 3 centuries of Portuguese rule. That is to say, the primary relationship of Brazil was with Europe. Still intellectually, culturally with Portugal to some extent, certainly and primarily with France in terms of culture and intellectual influences, but especially Britain. More than throughout the entire empire, more than half, 50 to 60% of all imports into Brazil came from Britain. only about a third of Brazil's exports went to Britain, mainly because the British didn't drink enough coffee, and the coffee went to Europe and the United States. 100% of the capital, all loans to Brazilian governments after 1855 through Rothschilds, all loans, and I think 98% of all foreign direct investment came from Britain. There's a big historical debate to the extent to which Brazil was part of what is called Brazil's informal empire in the 19th century. Brazil was inserted, in other words, into the international economy largely through Britain. And the links with Europe were reinforced by mass immigration in the late 19th century, beginning in the late empire, which, of course, until the Japanese arrived, all came from Europe, Portuguese and Italians mainly. The other link that Brazil had was with Africa, the strong historical links with Africa in the 19th century through the slave trade, which continued until 1850. The apotheosis of this was the Great Paris Exhibition in 1889. Brazil never considered itself as part of Spanish America, or what Spanish American intellectuals and governments increasingly called America Latina. Brazil felt itself separate by geography, obviously, but also by history, by its economic and social structures, by language and culture above all, by political institutions from the Spanish American republics. And the relationship that Brazil had with the neighbors were limited to the Rio de la Plata. There Brazil had strategic interests, and there Brazil fought 3 wars between 1825 and 1870. But apart from the Rio de la Plata, Brazil had they're almost non-existent, the relationships with the rest of Spanish America. Relations with the United States were mostly friendly. There were a few disturbances in the 1850s when the United States started getting very interested in opening up the River Amazon to free navigation. And the Brazilians, with some reason, thought that this was part of US manifest destiny, and before long the United States was not interested in commerce, it was interested in conquest. But apart from the Amazon drama of the 1850s, Brazil had friendly but extremely distant relations with the United States. The one single fact of importance was, of course, that the United States eventually came to buy 70% of Brazil's major export, coffee. Brazil never was interested in attending any of the conferences organized by Spanish American republics, starting with Bolivar in Panama and running through Santiago, Lima twice, Caracas, the various attempts by the Spanish American republics to create a union, a confederation of American states. They didn't invite Brazil, and when they hinted that Brazil might like to attend, Brazil refused to attend. On the other hand, Brazil was very happy to attend the first Pan-American Conference in Washington in 1889. If we look equally briefly, because of time, of course, at the First Republic, the period from the First Republic to the Second World War. This is the period of the emergence of the United States as first a regional hegemon and then a global hegemon. Brazilian intellectuals still looked to Europe, especially France. When they didn't look to Europe, they looked to what they called America, meaning the Americas, including the United States. There was no identification with Spanish America, America Latina, what Martí and Rodó called Nuestra America, what Mariátegui called Indo-America. Brazil had no connection with Nuestra America, America Latina, Indo-America, though the cultural links improved somewhat after the First World War. Brazilian governments also looked to Europe in the First Republic because until the First World War, Britain was still the major commercial partner and the major source of capital. Challenged now somewhat by Germany, but then Germany was knocked out by the First World War. Immigration now reached its peak, and the immigrants were European, Italians, Spanish, Portuguese. The Japanese came from 1908. Relations with Spanish America really boiled down to solving the problem of the frontiers. And very successfully in the early years of the First Republic, Brazil solved all its problems with all its neighbors in a series of 7 or 8 different negotiations and treaties, all of which were favorable to Brazil, except the negotiations with Britain, conducted by Joaquim Nabucco over British Guyana. Brazil lost heavily against the British in British Guyana. Brazil gained in all the other negotiations, most famously, of course, Acre in the negotiations with Bolivia. The only bilateral relations of any consequence, I would say, I'm no doubt simplifying somewhat, but the only really significant relationships were with Argentina and Chile. And slowly, the relationship with Argentina became a relationship of rivalry, even including a rather modest naval arms race before the First World War. Much closer were relations with the United States. Brazil continued to have these close demographic and economic relationships with the leading countries of Europe. Not much with Spanish America, but increasingly close relations with the United States. Brazil and the politicians of the First Republic imagined a world in which there were two great nations in the Americas, the United States in the north, Brazil in the south. And Brazil was happy to see, responded warmly to Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, believed that the United States was the defender of Brazil and the rest of Latin America against European imperialism, believed that the United States, by intervening in the republics of Central America and the Caribbean, was doing a favor to Spanish America by restoring order and stability. Brazil didn't complain about US intervention in the war with Spain in Cuba. On the contrary, welcomed it. And Brazil was always a supporter of Pan-Americanism and the Pan-American conferences. The Spanish-American republics were dominated by fear and mistrust, and with some reason believed that Pan-Americanism was just an instrument by which the United States would consolidate its economic and political domination of the area. Brazil did not feel, for the most part, that. And the apotheosis in this period was the Rio Conference in 1906, to which Nabucco came. Shades of Obama here. Root was the first, as Paulo said, the first Secretary of State to leave the United States. And he went to the Pan American Conference in Rio in 1906. And this was the final recognition of the two major countries in the hemisphere, Brazil and the United States. And then, of course, Brazil was disappointed because Root decided to visit Argentina and Chile and Peru afterwards. So should Obama just go to Brazil, or should he go to 2 or 3 Latin American countries as well? At the same time, US trade and finance became increasingly important to Brazil, and by the 1920s, the United States had replaced Britain as the major source of manufactured goods and capital goods, and in the 1930s, New York replaced London as the major source of both loans to governments and foreign direct investment. It's also during this period that Brazil begins its modest role in global international politics. Brazil makes its first appearance on the international stage, the first appearance of any Latin American country on the international stage at the Hague Peace Conference in 1907. And the Brazilian delegation, led by Rui Barbosa, and Rui Barbosa was the star of the show. You can read, I've been reading recently on the Hague Conference, the extent to which Rui Barbosa was the single most brilliant intellectual who made a huge impact on there, and is said to be the principal factor behind the acceptance by the Hague Peace Conference of the principle of the legal equality of all nations, which is the basis of all international law in the 20th century. Brazil alone in Latin America declared war on Germany alongside the United States. As Itamaraci said, we are placing Brazil beside the United States at a crucial moment in world history. And the president of Brazil, Venceslau Braz, said that only the unity of Brazil and the United States would lead the free peoples of the two Americas. This is the thinking in 1917. At the Versailles Conference, at US insistence, Brazil became a member of the committee to draw up the Convention of the League of Nations, one of 5 lesser countries with Belgium, China, Portugal, and Serbia. And again, at US insistence, Brazil became one of the 4 lesser nations with a non-permanent seat in the League of Nations, along with Belgium, Spain, and Greece. and Brazil remained the only Latin American. Of course, the United States did not join the League of Nations, but Brazil remained the one American state in the League of Nations until it withdrew in 1926 when Germany was admitted. And finally, of course, in the Second World War, Brazil was one of the first, was not alone now amongst Latin American nations in declaring war against the Axis powers, one of the first, along with the United States, and certainly played a much more material role, including 25,000 troops to Italy. And as a result, the Second World War consolidated the political, military, economic, and now cultural domination of Brazil by the United States. The relationship between Brazil and the United States, which is a major feature of this whole period, from the beginning of the Republic till the Second World War, the consolidation comes very much during the Second World War. Now, if we move on to the post-Second World War, Cold War period, now, of course, the relations with the United States become more problematic. Brazil was deeply disappointed, frustrated, at not getting special treatment at the end of the war. Didn't get a permanent seat in the United Nations, as hinted by the United States, but blocked by the Soviet Union and Britain. Did not get special economic assistance, despite all the efforts made during the war. Brazil was now seen in Washington as part of Latin America, one of 20 republics, the biggest, no doubt, but Latin America. And Latin America was now neglected. So the United States remained Brazil's closest bilateral relationship: trade, investment, technical assistance. Brazil was clearly, despite what some intellectuals like to claim now, Brazil was clearly part of the West. You hear Brazilians, well, of course, Huntington was one of the first here in the United States, but you hear intellectuals make the argument that Brazil has never been part of the West. It's not part of the West. Clearly, Brazil was part of the West in the sense that it was with the United States against the USSR, both if you think of the Cold War as a conflict over power, and if you think of the Cold War as a conflict over ideology. Whichever it was, both, Brazil was clearly on the side of the United States. President Dutra broke relations with the Soviet Union, crushed the Brazilian Communist Party, removed communists from the labor unions, all with Cold War justification. But the divisions now were clear in Brazil, in the Brazilian Foreign Ministry, Itamaraty, in the military, growing sense that Brazil ought to develop foreign policies that were more autonomous. You see, with Getúlio Vargas, did not send troops to Korea and insisted on close relations with Perón, who was persona non grata in Washington. Juscelino Kubitschek took the initiative in developing the idea of Operação Pan-Americana, and especially during the presidencies of Quadros and Goulart, Brazil, between 1961 and 64, Brazil developed a política externa independiente. Close relations with the Soviet Union, close relations with the Communist bloc, China, revolutionary Cuba, Africa, Asia, closer to the Third World. Apart from Cuba, no Spanish America. No, Spanish America wasn't part of this independent foreign policy. That was noticeably left out. And there is a problem here, of course. The Third World, South problem. Brazil is not anti-colonial, not part of the anti-colonial, post-colonial struggle against European imperialism or against the West. Brazil is independent and has been independent for 150 years and is in the Western Hemisphere and has a special relationship with the United States. So Brazil didn't join the non-aligned movement. It was mainly established observer status there. But on the Brazilian left, and amongst Brazilian nationalists, both left and right, the United States was seen as economically exploiting Latin America and politically dominating or making Latin America subordinate to its political interests. True, no doubt, for many parts of Latin America, but a big question mark over whether this is true of Brazil. If you look at Brazilian history before the early 60s, is it true that the United States exploited Brazil economically and dominated Brazil politically? But of course, the events of 1961 to 4 confirmed the view of the left. Because after the Cuban Revolution, with the United States regarding Juan Goulart as a communist and fearing that Brazil was going to become a second Cuba, a Cuban, or as some people said, a second China. Imagine Brazil becoming a second China in the early 60s. And we have many statements, notably by Robert Kennedy, believing that Brazil had the potential to become a second China, and the United States, therefore, as we all know, played a significant role in the overthrow of Goulart in 1964. Although it was domestically determined, the United States certainly played a role. The military dictatorship that followed the 64 golpe brought Brazil and the United States closer again. Brazil was o amigo certo nas horas incertas. Brazil was a country you could rely on from the point of view of Washington. And for example, Brazil led the intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965. And Brazil played a significant role in the coups in Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, the so-called inter-American Cold War. But in the 70s, with the military still in power in Brazil, there was a good deal of low-level conflict with the United States over trade, over nuclear power with West Germany, later with Carter about human rights. And again, once again, as in the early 60s, Brazil began to develop a more autonomous, more independent, third world foreign policy, different from that of the United States, and against US interests, as, for example, most famously in Angola, the recognition of the Agostinho Neto government in Angola in 1975, directly against US policy and interests. So we have a second wave in the mid-70s, as after the early 60s, of Brazil clearly still very close to its primary relationship with the United States, not taking much interest at all in Spanish America, and less interested now in Europe. Great Britain was now insignificant, of course, in this. Europe was less and less. Maybe Germany remained important, as in the nuclear issue. But in general, Europe not so important. Spanish America never important. The United States clearly central. And yet, once again, another example of Brazil wanting to create some more room for maneuver, some greater autonomy, challenging the United States in some key areas. But, as I've said, still no great engagement with Latin America, Spanish America, even South America. Even though now, by the 1970s, Brazil was clearly the dominant country in Latin America, certainly in South America. The population growth, the economic growth, 7% for 40 years was Brazil's economic growth between 1940 and 1980. Average per capita income in Brazil in 1930 was only 25% average per capita income in Argentina. In 1980, it was 85%, with a population of 200 million. There's a complete reversal of Brazil's position within the region. But even so, Brazil joined ALALC and later joined ALADI, but showed very little interest. For example, when Nixon and Kissinger developed their doctrine in 1964 of key regional countries, the world divided into regions, and we focus on one key regional leader, and we expect that country to play the sheriff role against communism for political stability. Of course, they chose Brazil. But Brazil showed no interest in shaping, organizing the region. Relations with Argentina, the other major country in South America, was at an all-time low in the 1970s. There was more intellectual and cultural exchange, maybe, between Brazil and Spanish America, especially on the left. The left, the intellectual left, is an exception here. The intellectual left did have close relations with the left in Spanish America during the Cold War. That's an important exception. And many Brazilian politicians of, say, center-left, not even of the left, I'm thinking of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, discovered, as Cardoso wrote in his memoirs, discovered that they were Latin Americans for the first time in exile in Chile, in his case. He wrote in his memoirs, when I arrived in Chile, I realized I seemed to be something called a Latin American. I'd never imagined I was a Latin American. Brazilians never think that they have anything in common with Mexico or Venezuela or Peru, but there I was in Santiago, and I began to think, well, maybe I do have a few things in common. Maybe I'm a Latin American. And in the 1980s, with all the economic difficulties and the political transition to democracy, Brazil became even more inward-looking. Apart from, and always the exception, apart from now the rapprochement with Argentina in the 1980s, leading to the creation of Mercosur. So finally, if we take a broad look at the post-Cold War period, and this is, I imagine you're much more familiar with this than some of the history, but since the 1990s, Brazil has been clearly much more consistently active, confident, even assertive in both regional and global affairs. For the first time in any sense commensurate with the size of Brazil, the population of Brazil, the resources of Brazil. For the first time, Brazil has played something of that role. As I said earlier, perhaps now punching above its real weight. And the reasons for this are, again, I guess, well known. I'll just flag them quickly, and Ambassador Einaudi will want to talk about this, no doubt. Brazil has changed, obviously, in the last 15 years. In addition to the 5 factors that are always counted in Brazil's potential greatness, its size, its natural resources, its population, its homogeneity, its peaceful nature. In addition to those, we now have political democracy for the first time in Brazilian history, with all its flaws, consolidated political democracy. Economic stabilization and a restoration of economic growth through the domestic market and mainly through commodities and China. Even the social problems, even the poverty and the extreme social inequality, I think the progress made in the last 8 years has been hugely exaggerated. But there certainly has been significant progress in dealing with Brazil's social problems, and there is a political will. Under Cardoso, and even more under Lula, there is a political will to play a greater role. Brazil much more ambitious in regional and global affairs, willing now for the first time to shape and influence regional and global institutions. So Brazil has changed in all these ways. But of course, the world has changed through accelerated globalization, through multipolarity, giving space for the rise of countries like Brazil, through new global issues in which Brazil is a major player, climate change, biofuels, food, water, these big global issues, Brazil cannot be ignored. And the region has changed. The United States is going through another period of neglecting, there have been many periods, of neglecting Latin America, certainly South America, neglecting South America, leaving a political vacuum. Argentina in long-term decline, Mexico with important, serious domestic problems, and Brazil growing. Brazil now accounts for almost 60% of the GDP of South America. And Brazil is trading with and investing in South America on a scale never seen before. So as a result of these factors, Brazil, as we all know, has been playing this much more prominent role in global affairs. I don't need to go through the details. Brazil in multilateral institutions, Brazil with the BRICS, Brazil with South Africa, Brazil with the community of Portuguese-speaking nations, Brazil, as we've seen, in the Middle East with Iran, South-South relations at the expense of relations with Europe and the United States, and clearly some kind of identity crisis. Is Brazil now part of the West, with its closest relationship to the United States and Europe, or is Brazil really part of what we used to call the Third World, we now call, say, the South? And here is all this soft power being exercised in global affairs and still very little hard power. Brazil is the only BRIC, of course, without nuclear weapons, as we know, and the national security, the national defense strategy announced in 2008 for modernizing and expanding Brazil's armed forces to defend the Amazon and to defend what's called the Blue Amazon, to defend the Atlantic, where the pre-sal oil is to be found. This is beginning to change the debate in Brazil. And then in regional affairs, for the first time in its history, Brazil is actively engaged with its neighbors. And you could argue that economic and political integration of the region is now Brazil's principal major priority. Brazil plays the game in hemispheric affairs. Brazil, of course, attends all the summits of the Americas, is part of the Western Hemisphere, though resisted, of course, the free trade area for the Americas. Brazil goes to all the annual meetings of the Rio Group since 1986. Brazil has been one of the founders of the new Latin American and Caribbean community, 33 countries without the United States and Canada. So Brazil is part of the Americas, is part of Latin America and the Caribbean, but there is no doubt that in the last 10 to 15 years, the focus has been much more on South America. Mercosul, and then Fernando Henrique, followed by Lula, creating what has become now the Union of South American republics, with the South American Defense Council. It's unclear whether Brazil really is ready and willing to lead the region, and it's unclear whether the countries in the region are willing to be led by Brazil. There is a great asymmetry of power now. Brazil really is the dominant country, and you hear talk of Brazilian imperialism and Brazilian domination. And there are alternatives on the board, including Hugo Chávez's ALBA. There's an interesting identity problem here. Just as Brazil continues to be ambivalent about its relationship with the United States, its relationship with Europe, its relationship with the rest of the South, here we have Brazil not entirely clear about its relationship to the United States within the hemisphere and its relationship to Latin America and South America. And in the piece, in the presentation I made last year, and in the piece I've just published on Brazil and Latin America, I concluded rather grandly with my final conclusion: let's forget about Latin America from a Brazilian point of view, maybe more generally. Maybe Latin America doesn't mean anything anymore, and certainly Brazil isn't part of it, and Brazil now is at least engaged for the first time with the region, but the region is South America, not Latin America. And then, having written and published this piece, almost a week afterwards, the Honduras crisis broke, and Lula started to talk about Nossa America Latina. And he went everywhere, talking about Nuestra America, Nossa America Latina. And then he created the Universidade Latino-Americana in Foz do Iguaçu. And then he was happy to go along with the Latin American and Caribbean community. And in one of his last statements as president at the 20th Cúpula Ibero-Americana in Mar del Plata, he said, "Eu sou político latino-americano." And you're not going to get rid of me. I'm staying in politics because eu sou andando pela América Latina. Now, fortunately, my friend Marco Aurelio Garcia, who is the advisor to Lula and now to Dilma, international advisor, gave two long interviews, Le Monde Diplomatique and Folha de São Paulo, in which he said, no. América do Sul. América do Sul is the only thing we're interested in. Queremos que América do Sul seja polo deste mundo multipolar. América do Sul. Sigh of relief. Then President Dilma goes on her first trip abroad to Argentina, embraces Cristina Kirchner, and declares, standing side by side, that Brazil and Argentina are crucial for the transformation of the 21st century into o século da América Latina. And she said, we are constructing a better world. We will construct a better world together para nossos povos e para os povos da América Latina. So, America Latina, America do Sul, there are still problems. And Brazil's role in regional and global affairs is hugely controversial in Brazil now, and much debated. What does Brazil want? Why does Brazil want it? And how will Brazil get what it wants? I'm very, very happy to hand over those questions to Ambassador Einaudi. My role was simply to try and put the history of Brazil's attitudes towards the region, whatever the region is, and towards the rest of the world on the table for discussion. Thanks.
Luigi, now you solve it for us.
What does Brazil want?
Well, not to be an American football, even an American football as you made it slightly when you talked about the image of a second China originating with, I don't know, was it Bobby Kennedy?
Kennedy said that, yeah.
Yes, but you know, Gilberto Freire talked about a tropical China in 1947, long before actually the triumph of the Chinese communists and before the idea, the politicization of the idea of China. Okay, that was my only criticism.
A different China.
Yes, of course. A different Brazil, a different world. We're actually a very strange pairing because Leslie pretends to be a public policy person, but is really a Brazil scholar. I now pretend to know something about Brazil, but I'm really a public policy person. So it comes really from two very different angles. You have, those of you who wish it, a pre-publication copy in English of my paper. It should any day appear without that horrible pre-publication draft disfiguring and be available also in Portuguese, thanks to a beautiful translation by Eloisa Marques. The origin of my paper, and then we can throw things out a little bit for discussion, and we may have slightly different views. The origin of my paper is only indirectly Brazil. The origin of my paper is arguments with Americans in the more or less Washington foreign policy establishment who fit perfectly Leslie's description of Washington seeing Brazil as one of 20, or maybe today, since we have to take into account the independence of the Caribbean, the former British Caribbean, one of 33 or 34 countries of Latin America. In fact, my experience has always been that Brazil has nothing to do with Latin America. That being in Brazil is like being in the United States, to the point that, with very few exceptions, if you look at the Brazilian press, it is self-immersed. It's interested in Brazil. Brazil is the center of the universe. The American press is self-immersed. The United States is the center of the universe. We are both enormous countries, and in this case, there is nothing of China in either of us. I have that funny superimposition of sizes just to shake people up, because most people really don't think that China, the US, and Brazil are really all the same essential size in continental terms. But China is an old civilization, an old settled civilization. The United States and Brazil are both new civilizations. They're both invading civilizations that have had to settle these enormous spaces. And that gives the United States and Brazil something very different and very unique There was a chap named Bolton who was a proper historian, the way you are. I think certainly not any relation to the current American Bolton, who makes a fool of himself on the international scene all the time, in spite of the fact that he was ambassador to the United Nations, who developed the thesis of the frontier. And as a common characteristic of the United States and Brazil. And then you start thinking of Brazil a little bit in comparison to its neighbors. And again, you are forced to the conclusion that I put on the first page. Brazil is Brazil. There are traditions of mutual accommodation, of can-doism. That's partly, of course, the frontier mentality. We have a problem, we'll solve it. There's also the optimism. We can build things, and the future will be ours. So suddenly one begins to realize that there is something different about Brazil, very similar to the United States, and it's not really part of Latin America. And I think it's very important for the United States to have that stereotype broken. I'll come back at the end, because I think that the United States and Brazil, another commonality that they have is that they have to be careful of their neighbors because of the asymmetry in power that has developed. But the reason, the fundamental reason why the stereotype of just lumping Brazil with Latin America from Washington is a mistake is not only that it isn't, but that it blocks the perception of Brazil's growth. Now, it is true that there are horrendous internal problems in Brazil. The transportation system is a disaster. Let me tell you, Brazil's agricultural produce to the gate of the farm is probably the cheapest in the world. The problem is that its transportation costs twice as much as Argentina or the US to get it into the market. Its educational system is a tremendous drain and, in a sense, a betrayal of our common democracy, if you will. As an American, I shouldn't say that too much, because we are having some very major educational problems ourselves. And then you see poor President Dilma Rousseff. She takes over as the first woman president immediately after these two extraordinary presidents, in Fernando Henrique and Lula, who had caught the world's imagination and lifted Brazil up, and the first thing she has to deal with is incredible mudslides and the proof of the fact that Brazil isn't quite there yet. And these internal vulnerabilities that made Brazil punch below its weight for a very long time are, in many cases, still there and still need to be dealt with. That said, if you think and start measuring where Brazil is on virtually every modern measurement of power, the economy, since they controlled inflation, Brazil has been growing at a dramatic rate. And already Leslie has said it, but let's just repeat it. It's been aided, it's true, by, to some extent, the underperformance of Argentina over these last 20 years. But Brazil has simply pulled away from its own neighborhood and is at the top of the world production in commodity after commodity, agricultural commodity after agricultural commodity. We as Americans are so used to thinking of our great meat production, and maybe somebody remembers, oh, well, Argentina has some too, and Argentine beef can be pretty good when we allow it in here. But the number one beef producer in the world is Brazil. And so it goes in area after area. And very little of this has been seen from the United States. And as a result, it becomes a source of tension between the United States and Brazil. Because Brazilians were, I don't know, you said it with a definitiveness that shook me, Leslie, but there was a moment, certainly, when Brazil felt itself within the American mythology. And New York was the greatest city that a Brazilian could go to. It was all, but then they come here and we don't know they exist. And we plan a president's visit, and he goes to Rio for a day and then continues on to Uruguay. And I can remember standing there on the New Year's Eve, I don't know, then when Lula was being sworn in the next day, on the beach in Rio. And I was with Enrique Iglesias, a good Uruguayan, and he looked at the beach and he said, "Do you know there are more people on this beach right now than there are people in Uruguay?" Now, Brazilians know that, but Americans don't. Brazil is just one of those countries down there. Well, it isn't. And Brazil has a very interesting tradition. Leslie told you the story of Brazilian interest and participation in conferences at the turn of the last century, of Brazilian sense of having a role to play in the world. And it's not pure chance that it became peacefully an independent empire, that the empire was replaced by the republic peacefully after a tradition of empire that had ties in Asia, in Africa. The Portuguese Empire was, in 1815, at its height, one of the largest empires in the history of the world. True, some of that was due to the extent of Brazil, but a lot of it wasn't. There was a lot of space elsewhere, and there was a mindset that began to develop. I remember a very good Brazilian diplomat friend of mine who in World War II would go to the beach as a kid. And there he met displaced European monarchs. I remember particularly, he told me of his encounter with, I don't know, I think the exiled king of Romania. I have no idea. You're not part of Latin America. You're part of a broader outer world. And you need to have a role in that. And what's interesting, again and again, the inability of the U.S. to see that over the last generation has led to a hardening of feelings among Brazilian elites that not only can we not see it, but we will never see it, and therefore it is a waste of time to try to cooperate with the United States. And suddenly you get the automatic alliance of World War II going through some of the various maneuvers that Leslie carefully produced, but described, but which really at bottom comes if we want to organize and find people with whom to cooperate, we have to look elsewhere. The U.S. is part of our problem, no longer part of our hope and progress and support. And this began to develop. It showed dramatically as a side effect that we didn't see here of the military coups and governments that followed the overthrow of Goulart, and took its height frictions over the potential development of nuclear weapons, frictions over trade, because of course this agricultural explosion, which was followed by an explosion in steel production, which was followed by all kinds of things, came up against American barriers. It was trade, 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 and then no response, and therefore we're going to look elsewhere. Now, we went through an interesting period. Everybody now talks about this latest Brazilian explosion onto the world. And it was even there a little bit in your sort of listing of the last 10 or 15 years. The last 10 or 15 years, to some extent, is a Brazilian demonstration of the same kind of hubris that the United States showed in invading Iraq. We can go out there and we can change the world our own way. It has created lots of problems for Brazil. It has smashed the foreign policy consensus within Brazil. It burned one small moment, the pirouetting of President Lula with the Iranians and the Turks on the nuclear issue, destroyed a whole tradition of peaceful Brazilian diplomacy. It need not have, but it did. The South America is one thing, and it's bad enough for Brazil to attempt to say, I speak for South America, but when they tried to impose their view on Honduras, you know, it's just a question of arrogance that, as an American, I recognize because I see it in myself and in some of my colleagues sometimes, but it awakens resistance. A friend of mine from Latin America the other day read my paper, and he said, you know, Brazil really is a giant with feet of clay and therefore dangerous. Now, there's a little bit of envy and unhappiness in that, obviously. No, it wasn't. It was Latin American. I see, that's the point. I will not go into nationality. No, it actually wasn't an Argentine, believe it or not.
We're getting close.
But yes, you don't know. I didn't tell you this story, but you're quite good. The point is that there is a problem for Brazil that it has been punching over its weight. All right, so the time has come to consolidate. Brazil has more embassies abroad than anybody else, essentially. I mean, they have more embassies than we do in the Caribbean. They have more embassies than the UK does in Africa. They have received more embassies. They're within 5 embassies of having many people in Washington, and everybody knows that Washington's the capital of the universe. There are more there than there are in Peking. They have to staff these things. They've got to organize these things. They're doing a marvelous job, actually, but they need to concentrate on that and start pulling back. I think they will. And there is a central psychological realization. I've been talking psychology to you all, to a large extent here, and the psychological realization is more can be done working with the U.S. than against it. Because part of the pride that was this explosion was the idea that the United States didn't count anymore. And it's certainly true we've done a lot to earn that. And there are sort of heavinesses to our system that make it immobile and not responsive on a lot of issues. But in fact, and I'm going to shut up, you're looking at your watch, so I look at mine and I say, my heavens. So we have to break the American habit of not seeing and the Brazilian habit of fearing. And if we do, we don't need to exaggerate. We have similarities, but we're very different countries. We should not go around, recent administrations have talked about strategic partnership. No, we're not going to be partners with them. Among other things, the United States has too many other problems, and it's not even going to see Brazil again a lot of the time. But yes, the United States needs to take into account Brazil's strengths. And one of the strengths that Brazil has, which goes all the way to its origins, at least its independent origins, which is negotiation, peaceful, nonviolent resolution of conflicts, is something that should match up very well, could match up very well with the United States, with its emphasis on hard power. If we can marry Brazil's soft power to our hard power, or our hard power to Brazil's soft power, I suspect we would all be better off. So we need to recognize and welcome Brazil's emergence. We need to invest in people who can interpret between these two countries, who, after all, are divided by different languages. And we need to play to each other's strengths. And we need to, both of us, pay serious attention to constructive relations with our immediate other neighbors in the hemisphere. It is not chance that my history basically is a multilateralist history. It's one where I have actually learned from Brazilian diplomats how to do a lot of things, because they work naturally in a multilateral environment, which we, with our emphasis on bilateralism, do not recognize. And I think we need the multilateral environment. You mentioned the principle of the juridical equality of states. We need environments where small countries who otherwise do not get their voice are given the chance to have their voice, and that's important in front of the giant Brazil and in front of the giant United States. And that can be done at the United Nations, it can be done at the OAS, and it can be done by both of us showing a little bit more respect for Central American integration, for example, than we have done so far. But I'll stop there and we can throw things open.
Okay. Thank you, Luigi. Just before starting to do questions, I have to make two observations. First, I forgot to recognize a wonderful Brazilian diplomat, Maria Eduarda de Seixas Correia, is here, that is a consular at the embassy, where she deals with institutions like this one, among other things. Two observations. One, in the eve of this trip by President Obama to Brazil, that we obviously hope will happen, we hope that Congress of the United States will do something about the budget, allowing the president to go. I think we should think about how extraordinary it was, the movements that happened in the two capitals, and because of diplomats of the two countries. After what the crisis in relationship last year, that should not be underestimated, was very, very serious. Was the most serious crisis in bilateral relations in over 30 years, because to Honduras and the Iran issues. I find it fascinating that not only the diplomats, and especially what President Dilma Rousseff did in order to open the space, to make this viable, for this moment of re-engagement. The other part is what Luigi was saying at the end about this, and Rubens Recupero and others wrote about this, the collapse of the national consensus on foreign policy in Brazil. There is something that's happening now that I find very positive, and sort of is a recognition of the problem and a search for a solution. We know now that the current team in the foreign ministry, led by a younger generation of diplomats, especially Ambassador and now Minister Antonio Patriota, that actually had his debut with think tanks in Washington as ambassador in this very room in 2007, has now reached out to some of the most acerbic critic of Brazilian foreign policy in the last few years to establish dialogue. So you now have the Foreign Minister of Brazil in contact and consulting with former foreign ministers, with former ambassadors that were more identified with President Cardoso and that had been kind of ostracized. So this is very interesting of this moment that's happening in Brazil as Brazil searches its place in the world. With that, I wanted to invite you to ask questions to our two distinguished guests and friends. Yes, sir.
My name is Joe Dukert. I'm an independent energy analyst and also a senior associate at CSIS in political economics. I hope you will forgive me for two small questions, but they are based on Professor Bethel's description of how Brazilian attitudes have evolved, as I understood your really brilliant exposition. First of all, one goes to a quote from Reardon Roet in this document, in the full-day conference you arranged. I could ask Reardon, but I'm really interested in your response, and maybe Professor Rinaldi's, Ambassador Rinaldi's. He says, if the pre-salt fields do indeed produce the amount of oil expected, Brazil is expected to become a member of OPEC. Now, my question is, why in the world would Brazil, with the evolution of its attitudes to the rest of the world, be interested in joining OPEC, which it could not dominate? The second small question is, why don't Lula and Jalma and other Brazilians show more interest in the term Ibero-America? Because it covers most people.
Let me comment on Ibero-America first. That's easier for me. All this discussion of what to call the region is really quite fascinating if you're an intellectual historian. For most people, it's not interesting at all, of course. It's irrelevant now. But at the time, there were huge debates. I remember in 1918, a group of historians decided to form a journal, an academic journal, on what we now call Latin American history. So what do we call it? You have no idea what the debates were like. They went on for days. There were votes on whether it should be Latin America, Ibero-America, Hispanic, and they went round and round and they were all rejected. Nobody could really agree on what to call this region. And in the end, they decided on Hispanic, which of course is the name chosen by the Library of Congress too, from Hispania, because Hispania meant Spain and Portugal, and therefore you could include, whereas Latin America was Spanish America, Ibero-America, it was very complicated. On we go. And I think now the only way in which Ibero-America continues is when you have the summits of the Latin American countries with Spain and Portugal. And they happen, and Brazil is an active member. The other thing to say, I think, is that I don't know about the Spanish-American republics in this regard and Spain, but Brazil does take Portugal quite seriously, and Brazil takes even more seriously Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa. So Brazil takes the CLPC meetings, and especially its relations with Angola, which is the big giant emerging in Africa, and Mozambique very seriously. So there is an interest in Ibero-America in Brazil, and there is an interest in Portugal and Portuguese Africa. On the pre-sal, the big question is if, of course, if the pre-sal oil is got out of the sea. I don't know. Do you have comments on OPEC? I have no idea. I don't hear a discussion about OPEC.
I could say something. Yeah. I think this comment by Riordan was made in the context of some comments that then Foreign Minister Celso Amorim made. But it was very interesting because Celso Amorim raised the possibility of one day Brazil joining the Organization of Oil Exporting Countries. But he immediately added this observation that we would be mindful of the interest of poor countries. We would not be a country that would be there to support price increases at all times. So it was sort of a moment there. It has never been consolidated as a policy. I don't believe that there is a paper at this point at the Foreign Ministry or anywhere else proposing that. This was, part of probably a press interview and to be revisited in the future. I would like, yes, sir.
No, I was going to support very much what you said. It's hard to prejudge the future, and particularly on the oil. I don't want to be a killjoy or a kill sport, because a lot of people seem to be already counting Brazil as an oil power. It is an energy power already, but getting that stuff out from under there is going to be very, very expensive and costly and
dangerous.
Anywhere between $600 billion and $1 trillion of investments will be needed in the next 10 to 15 years. So if you have any money to invest, please be ready. Carlos Portales.
Thank you. Two questions. The first one has to do with the relation with the region, and I think this is important because this confusion is not always in the academic debates or putting a title, but it's also among our own countries. I think Brazil is part of the Ibero-American Summit, but this is mainly a Spanish enterprise. And Spain is very interested in Brazil because they have a lot of investment in Brazil as well as in the rest of Latin America. So, but Brazil has not been a major country interested in Ibero-American project. He is there, as always, he's cautious. But if the things that Luigi said are true, and I think they are true about the difference between Brazil and the rest of Latin America, we have to, and when I say we, everyone from the different perspectives, have to rethink the question of integration and of inter-American organization. Because the problem is that these organizations are in a moment where the different players don't know how to use them, this institution. And if you recognize that the United States is a power, well, that is agree, and the Brazil is a different power, and the rest of the countries have something to say, well, we need to think about how to use this organization that comprises all the countries in terms of what the program, what the activities could play. And that is in the interest of all the players, of Brazil, of the United States, and in the rest of the countries. And I suppose with this sentence, my Mexican friend will be very annoyed. The second question is a question of the change, of the recent change in Brazilian foreign policy. This morning I heard, and I'm not if it's true, but I heard in the TV, that there was a statement today by Foreign Minister Patriota in the name of IPSA saying that they are raising the non-Western position against the no-fly zone in Libya, which is very interesting. I don't know if it's true, it was confirmed, but if that is true, it goes against the idea of a change.
Yeah, if I could just reply, sure, yeah. I think what they said was that they would endorse a no-fly zone only in the context of a UN resolution. In other words, no sort of going it alone on the part of the United States if it's not embedded in, a decision by the UN Security Council or whatever. I think that was my reading of the statement, which I thought was actually quite positive.
But I heard that that was a non-Western view. I don't know if that was achieved to the minister or was...
You mean it was presented as a these words were used, non-Western view.
Do you want to react to what Carlos mentioned on relations in the
Two
region?
things quickly. We heard Ricardo Lagos in this center, I think last year, whenever it was, and he made this point, which is very interesting. I asked him what he thought about UNASUR. I said, as a former president of Chile, what is your view of UNASUR? Led by Brazil, of course. And he said, well, I've been through many of these before. I've seen these institutions before. There have been many attempts. We've heard them. I don't take them too seriously. Well, do you take any of these things? I take the Rio Group seriously. I think the Rio Group is important for the reasons you've said. He said, there has to be an organization which represents the whole of Latin America and parts of the Caribbean. Because if we didn't have anything, he said, I hear this when I go to Europe, I hear it when I go to China. If there was no such organization, the rest of the world would deal with Latin America through Brazil. They would say, we just deal with Brazil. We don't need to worry about anything else. Let's just go to Brazil. And only if you have an organization which represents all the other countries as well as Brazil will people do dealings with them. That's a possibility.
Well, Cindy.
Sure. Thanks, Paulo. Following up, I think, on something that Paulo said earlier, my question is whether there's a division between, say, the Brazilian public and Brazilian elites with respect to Brazil's role in the world. In the United States, historically, there was isolationism as opposed to, a desire for engagement. And so part one of the question is, how do sort of Brazilian citizens feel about this, emergence in the last 15 years? And then picking up on what Paulo said, I was wondering if you could describe a little bit more the varying opinions within the sort of relevant foreign policy elite intellectuals about what kind of role Brazil should play. Because if there is a sense over the last 15 years that they have a role to play on the global stage, that they engage, that the internal coherence gives them the capability to do all these things, surely there are divisions, and very important divisions, obviously played out over the Iranian case. But what are the sort of the various strains of thought? Or is there a consensus within the foreign policy elite?
I would say it's almost impossible to know. What does the street, as we now have to say, what does the street think in Brazil? How does one know these things? I've seen very few opinion polls that go to this level to ask this kind of question. All the discussion, for example, the best survey of Brazilian public opinion, which really meant the foreign policy community, was carried out by Amory de Souza for SEBRE in 2001 and then again in 2008. He interviewed and sent questionnaires to 250 people, the core, key businessmen, diplomats, academics interested in Brazil's role in the world. And the result, of course, was very confusing. There was no clear consensus, but he didn't go below that foreign policy elite. I've no means of knowing. I don't know whether anybody else has any sense of what the street thinks in Brazil. I would say one other thing, though, about divisions. This is much debated, so there are clearly divisions. Part of the division is political. The Lula administration rejected most of what the Cardoso administration had achieved or thought it had achieved, including in foreign policy, and there was a clear division between Cardoso people and Lula people, which may now be being bridged. But there's also an ideological division, which partly cuts across the same, because many of the people in power under the Lula administration come from the left in the 70s. This is where they come from. And their view of the world, you think of Marco Aurelio Garcia, who was an extremely intelligent and well-educated and well-informed person, and his views are extraordinarily rigid on how the world works. And he sees the world through the prism of the left as it was in the 70s, in the Cold War. And a lot of the anti-Americanism comes from this period, and it was very manifest. And this is one of the key divisions within the establishment, the foreign policy establishment.
May I quickly? Views born in the 70s or in the 30s or in the 90s burn themselves out over time, and circumstances change. I think that this Obama trip, if it takes place, will make a major difference for Brazilian views of the United States, and hopefully, since Obama has had very little exposure to South America at all, in at least the President of the United States' view. And one of the reasons that's significant is that, unfortunately, the second Bush president of the United States and the Iraq War created a foil for those 70s views that was extremely damaging to the United States. Now, let me say something further about Brazilian view. I tried to say in the paper that Brazil and the United States are getting more alike in terms of the cacophony of voices and sounds when it comes to foreign policy, because it used to be, and it wasn't even that many years ago, that Itamaraty, i.e. the Brazilian Foreign Ministry and Foreign Service, could impersonate Brazil to the outside world. This extraordinary body of skilled diplomats, great linguists, marvelous cultural globalists, they interpreted Brazil to all of us outsiders, and we were all amazed. They had nothing to do, or very little to do, with many ordinary Brazilian problems. And the positions they took were not known to many Brazilians. So the democratization of Brazil is an important aspect of all that's going on. And I have one last thing which is important, I think. The UN Security Council seat, the United States has endorsed India. India is not only a nuclear power, it is a non-member of the NPT. It has a very bad record of international law, almost like the United States. Brazil is an extraordinarily law-abiding country. Not necessarily internally. We've all, as Americans, we tear Brazil apart over the state of who's in prison, for example. One of the oldest ritornelli, to use the Italian word, about Brazil. I mean, you know, if you had an education, you didn't go to prison. Okay, we can all compare. But in terms of international law, Brazil has been extraordinary. And the Inter-American Juridical Committee, that probably nobody here has ever heard of, is in Rio. The Brazilians' history in terms of all of the significant international legal institutions is really very good. And in that sense, Brazil has earned a place on the Security Council.
Can I just add one quick word on replying to Cindy? She raised the question of what the public, as well as the elite, what they think of the rest of the world, including the United States. One thing, we talked about this at a seminar the other day, Paolo and I. I'm always struck at how ignorant Washington is about Brazil, how ignorant the United States is about Brazil. We've touched on this. I mean, there is extraordinary little expertise, extraordinary little knowledge of Brazil in this town and in this country. But then when you look at the other side, Brazil, we discussed this the other day, there is now a small center of Latin American studies in the University of Brasilia. It's the first time any university has felt it worthwhile studying Latin America. There is no single, there is one in a private institution, not really. In a university, there is no center of United States studies. You cannot find Brazilian specialists on China or India or the Middle East. They are so thin on the ground. Brazilians, on the whole, do not think about the rest of the world.
Just a Washington is, thank you, is as ignorant of the rest of Latin America as it is about Brazil, or is this specific to Brazil? I would certainly argue that the levels of ignorance of things that happen in our own hemisphere are enormous. And I guess my question is whether you are singling out Brazil from the rest of the region, and I apologize for using the word region because I understand that's a very complicated notion. But you know, do you think that there is particular ignorance of Brazil vis-a-vis other parts of the Western Hemisphere, or is it
I think
just like
that
everybody else?
If Brazil were the same, if all the Latin American countries were the same size, I would still be struck by the fact that Brazil is less understood and less studied than any other Latin American country. And it's true in all US universities. 95% of Latin Americanists in this country study Spanish America. 50% of them study Mexico, with good reason, but they don't study Brazil. Given the size of Brazil, compared with the other Latin American countries, then it's even more remarkable that Brazil is not well known. And I think to that extent, I do think Brazil is less studied and less understood than other Latin American countries.
The price of ignorance with regard to Brazil is greater than with regard to most of the other countries. Yeah. There's another thing, though, that we should remember. Spanish is becoming the second language of the United States. Portuguese is not. And they are two different languages and cultures.
And it's now being taught in schools in Brazil, Spanish. Two things. No, very important. Two things about Brazil as international law-abiding citizen. Brazil was one of the first countries to internalize sanctions against Iran, including the ones Brazil voted against. So that illustrates that fact. Cindy, on measuring popular sentiment on foreign policy, there is something that came out in a Época, it's a weekly magazine in Brazil, a journalist that followed one Brazilian family in the industrial city of Osasco near São Paulo for the 8 years of the Lula government. This is one of the families that sort of rose from the ranks of the poor to the middle class. And she tells something. I was with her in Italy in a seminar, and she said, it's amazing that I was with them, and one day President Lula is speaking at the United Nations. And the man on the house stands up to listen to the president speak at the United Nations in tears. I say, but why is that? I said, oh, this is like I was there speaking to the world. There is this, it's immaterial, it's symbolic, but this notion that you have a place, etc., is difficult to measure, but there is something. Brazilians are very proud of having that kind of projection, although I absolutely agree they don't. For instance, one of the greatest challenges for Brazilian diplomats in the region and elsewhere in the world is to become a permanent member of the Security Council. I hope that our schools are starting to really gear up in geography, and because we are going to have to learn where are all those countries where we are going to have to, to interact with, etc. Now, questions at the back, the very back there. I'll come back.
Good afternoon. Very fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask Leslie to dive into the points around the strengths of Brazil. And you referenced in the beginning and towards the end this strength of homogeneity. I was very struck by that and wanted to see if you could elaborate on your understanding of homogeneity from the Brazilian perspective or from your perspective as an intellectual. Because as someone who follows Brazil and has lived there several times, and I'm an American, I don't have that same understanding and perception from the part of Brazilians. And the reason why I'd like to see if you could tie that to a little bit of the ambassador's reference of its involvement around the world versus your vision of its involvement around the world, it seems like that perception also affects their foreign policy, affects their relationship with the rest of the region in terms of, as you said, they were part of, like the USA, the invading powers. So the indigenous people that lived there, the Africans and the Asians and everyone else who came or were forced to come to Brazil have a very different relationship with the state, with the government. And yet, as Brazil works around the world, those populations will affect a fair amount of its understanding of how it interacts with the rest of the world. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, that's kind of what's happened here. Our foreign policy has been very much shaped as our immigrant populations have become part of mainstream American society. So could you touch on that? I'm very curious if you have any thoughts about that question. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a very important question. It would take hours, of course, of discussion. My quick reaction is that I think I say, my feeling is that of countries in the world, of the size of Brazil, we're talking about half a dozen countries, enormous continental size countries. Which of them have the homogeneity that Brazil has, where there is only one language, Portuguese? There is a cultural homogeneity in the sense that people are proud to be Brazilian, think they're Brazilian, believe that Brazil was created through some sort of cultural, social, racial miscegenation. The immigrants in Brazil are totally integrated and don't, even compared with the United States, don't think of themselves as Italian Brazilians or Lebanese Brazilians. I get very little of that. Religion, well, there is a tiny Muslim community in parts of the Northeast, I think coming from Africa, mainly from Africa, and some Middle East, but mainly from Africa. And otherwise, there is no major religious conflict. Given the size of the country, and given its history in the early 19th century, of course, there's a great pride in statehood, there's a great pride in regions. I know Pernambuco very well for personal reasons, and people from Pernambuco are very proud to be from Pernambuco. But there's no sense that the region somehow cuts across the nation. So there's the one issue that could be debated, and we haven't got time now unless people wish to, is race, of course. Now that is an extremely complex question, and one would be very, very bold, as I just hinted, to claim that Brazil has no racial conflict or disunity. But again, put it in perspective. If there is some race issue in Brazil, how serious it is compared with the race issue in most other comparable countries. So I still take the view that Brazil is unusually homogeneous, the Brazilian population, and is proud of the miscegenation. There are 700,000 indigenous people in a population of 200 million. The issue of who is black and who is not black is so complicated in Brazil because it really is almost impossible to say. What is the black population of Brazil? We could talk about the race issue, I'm sure. And in terms of Brazil representing itself to the rest of the world, I don't know that the ethnic makeup or even the racial makeup or religion in Brazil is a major issue. Brazil is a Portuguese speaking. Remember that 25% of the population of the South speaks Portuguese. Portuguese is a major language in the South because of Brazil and Angola and Mozambique. But I don't think do any of these issues profoundly affect Brazil's attitude to the world. It affects Brazil's attitude to Spanish America. I think it does affect its attitude to Spanish America. The rest of the world, I'm open to discussion.
Just one observation. In terms of the race issue, it's obviously recognized that there is a problem. President Cardoso, who studied, his PhD thesis is on the structure of Brazilian society. And as president, he very courageously said, let's stop with the racial democracy business. There is a racial problem in Brazil, and let's confront it. That's what started the affirmative action programs in Brazil that today include Itamaraty. There are specific programs because we need to have a diplomatic corps that looks more like Brazil. And this is active policy being pursued, and I find that may respond part of your question. But we have a question.
Just finally on that, it is debated, of course. The affirmative action program in Brazil is extremely controversial. And there are a whole raft of prominent students of race relations and of Brazilian society who are totally against the quota system in Itamaraty, in universities, elsewhere. This is an extremely complex and sensitive issue. It isn't the case that Brazil has switched from pretending it was a racial democracy to recognizing it has a race problem that must be dealt with by affirmative action. It's not like that at all.
Thank you both for your presentations. Duarte Valente from Georgetown University. My question goes to Mr. Bethel. As a Portuguese, I noticed that you said Portugal was taken very seriously by Brazil and the CPLP group as well. But I noticed in your book you don't have a chapter dedicated to Portugal. Now, why is that?
Oops, which book?
The regional history, the Brazilian...
On what I'm trying to write now?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's no. Well, I finished the chapter on the empire just recently and sent it off to Madrid. And there I discuss at some length how, with independence, of course, Portugal no longer has political or economic clout in Brazil. That just almost disappears. But because of language and culture, Portugal continues to be an important presence in Brazilian culture and society. And then, when immigration starts from Europe, the first wave of immigration in the 19th century is Portuguese. The Italians don't come until 1884. The Portuguese come from 1850. So there's a whole wave of new Portuguese between the 1850s and the 1880s, mainly to Rio de Janeiro. So that strengthens the Portuguese, particularly in Rio. But in Brazil, since Rio is the capital, Brazil, the Portuguese presence is important. And then if you shift to the modern period, I don't want to exaggerate this, of course. In the greater scheme of things, of course, Portugal's not important. But it is a way into the EU. It is the way that Spanish-American republics have used Madrid. Brazil is aware. Brazilian presidents visit Portugal regularly. They know that Portugal is important because of the links, but also Portuguese investment in Brazil and Brazilian investment in Portugal, access to the EU, and there is a clear awareness in Brazil, in government and in business, that Africa is the future. And we Brazilians have a special deal there, because one of the countries that really matters, apart from South Africa and maybe Nigeria, is Angola. And we're in Angola. The Brazilian multinationals have been in Angola for 30 years. They know. I heard Roger Anelli, the president of Vale, say, for us, Africa is the future. So, and he meant Angola. So there is a link there.
I see a chapter on Portugal.
Peter Wogert from the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. I want to play devil's advocate. We just went all through the financial crisis, and we know that the US and Europe obviously suffered most of it and still have to recover. It will take a long time. Why shouldn't Brazil say, já era? I mean, the US was a good power, we had to have good relations, but now we are the South. And will this play a role? And I haven't read anything on intellectuals. Are they just, kind of getting this out? And Itamaraty obviously will not, as good diplomats, say it openly, but I wonder what your idea is about it.
I'd like Ambassador Einaudi to answer this, but before he does, I wanted to make the only comment I had on his excellent paper, and I've just mentioned to him privately. I think he makes a powerful case, and he did in his presentation, of why the United States really must take Brazil more seriously. I wasn't sure he made quite such a powerful case about why Brazil needs the United States as much as it should. And this comes back to this. Why can't Brazil just forget the United States, as it forgets Spanish America and goes off with the South?
Mr. Ambassador, the mic is yours.
Well, it would be a bit lonely. No, one of the issues that needs to be hit on, and that I was thinking that we needed to talk about, it's not directly this, but it relates. First, on that issue, yes, I think that Europe, one of Europe's problems, and I see it much more because of my Italian roots and the 6 months of the year I now spend in Italy, but there is a sense that the greatness of Rome is gone, and that we are under siege by this modern world. In my small town of 4,800 people, we had to relay the town square, and the construction workers who came in with a bid at 60% of the best local bid were Chinese laborers. So in Europe, if I can generalize, or if I won't, I'll just say Italy, there is a sense of the past. I, as an American, have always thought of the future. We still think we can build things. So do the Mexicans, so do the Brazilians, so do the people of the New World. There is something there that we often miss, that there is that piece of something. Now, but the second part of the answer is that this, whether it's the new America or the new US or the older Europe, we still have an enormous amount to contribute. And life is easier and better with us than against us. There's no doubt of that in my mind. But one of the things that needs saying, and it's an interesting one, because US citizens looking at Brazil or looking at the outside world like to think that, of course, these people are emerging. They should be our partners. They should see the world the way we do. They should observe women's rights and human rights generally the way we do. They should do everything the way we do. They should even build armed forces with our airplanes, and we fight with other developed countries to sell them airplanes. Well, the fact is, they are different. They have a different experience, a different view, and very often they are united by opposition to us, because that is the price of our progress and of our arrogance or our blindness. So that, for instance, we have talked about the Ibero-American Summit. The real meaning of the Ibero-American Summit has been, on the one hand, that the U.S. is excluded, and on the other hand, that Cuba is not. And it's a little way of saying we are being universal and true to universal values here when we're doing this. And the day that Cuba really goes the way of Libya, the Ibero-American Summit will lose a little bit of its vitality. And the day that Obama shows that he's really the American president and the Americans really like him and that the Tea Party is not the American future, why, then the Ibero-American Summit will also lose a little bit more. But the importance for the American policy toward Brazil, and this has to do with the basic attitudes of people. It's not whether we like Iran or Cuba or this policy or that policy. It's that the United States likes Brazil for Brazil, and Brazil likes the United States for the United States. That is to say, we respect each other in spite of the fact we know perfectly well we are very different. And I think that that needs to be understood and said and conveyed.
Yeah, I think the idea of Brazil dropping the United States would encounter some resistance in Brazilian society. You know, obviously, depending on what happens internally here and there. If Obama is a successful president, is re-elected, is able to carry out his program, I think that idea will become much less, you know, viable questions. Yeah.
Charles Martin, one quick point. I believe some pertinent numbers are that 3 million college students study Spanish in the United States. 13,000 study Portuguese.
Mm-hmm. Yes, let's collect. Let's collect. Please let.
Hi, Chelsea Markle with Institute of World Politics. Thank you for the great presentation today. It was very enlightening. I have sort of a two-pronged question. The first part is domestically with the World Cup and the Olympics coming up, huge amounts of money are going to be invested in infrastructure in Rio in particular. How is that going to inspire further infrastructure investment more inland in Brazil, bring it up to par with the outskirt coastal cities? Then my second question is on a grander scale, how can the U.S., in your opinions, sort of encourage a more bilateral relationship with Brazil economically when UNASUR is becoming a little bit, it's blocking a free trade agreement from developing. So how can the U.S. sort of work around that and, you know, encourage more economic relationship? Thank you.
Could I get well, let's answer this one, and then we'll have the last question by Marklo. Yes, could you?
Well, I leave maybe the question of UNASUR to Luigi, but I'm one of the few people living in Brazil who thinks that it's a disastrous idea that the Olympics are coming to Rio in 2016. I would hardly dare say that in Rio. There is such enthusiasm.
You are on video now.
Yeah. There is enormous enthusiasm, of course, and I think that there is such a thing as civic pride, and I understand why Cariocas are proud that Rio has been chosen for the Olympics. But I look around the world at what has happened to other cities that have held the Olympic Games, and it's not a pretty picture. There are some successes, but some terrible disasters. And let's see what happens in London in 2012. But I think the serious point, it is there that Brazil, we all know how much investment Brazil needs in infrastructure. Luigi mentioned this. We all know that Brazil is investing heavily in hydro in the Amazon. These huge dams are being built in the Amazon. Controversial, but they're going to be built. The infrastructure investment is needed. We all know that Brazilian education is a total disaster area. And sad to say, I noticed in Folio this morning, we all used to say, well, basic education, secondary education is not very good, needs an enormous amount of investment, but Brazilian universities are great. And as Folio pointed out this morning, there is not a single Brazilian university in the top 100 in the latest Times Higher Educational listing. So this is rather alarming for Brazilian universities and science and technology. So investment is needed in all these areas, and at the same time, Pre-Sal, whatever the figure, frightening figures that Paulo gave us for the amount of money needed for Pre-Sal, and we have the World Cup and the Olympics. Something's got to give. This is not going to be easy to raise this kind of funding.
Yeah, no, I'll let that stand. Clearly, if you need to develop the interior and have a tremendous demand to develop one major city that's already developed, there are problems. And I think you're right. On the other hand, I don't think that the problems are nearly as great in terms of the UNASUR. I think, first of all, that is more political than an economic instrument. And second of all, that there are 12 or 10 members, all of whom have their own interests, and it will take a while for everything to work. And right now, if Brazil isn't going to be able to invest as much internally as it wishes, it's going to have even less to develop, invest, to really integrate South America. I think on the economic front, the bigger issue is for the United States to see Brazil and see it as a potential ally economically in certain areas. I am not an economist, but I think that both of us have a problem in dealing with manufacturers from China. On the other hand, both of us need China. So there's a certain triangulation that is possible or that should be looked at, that to make the impact of globalization less damaging to each of us. I comment in my paper, I have no idea how real this is, but the U.S. has a major breadbasket, likes to think of itself as one of the agricultural powerhouses of the world. It hasn't learned that there are others, including Brazil. But we don't have the same weather at the same time. They're in the southern hemisphere, we're in the north. There are lots of things that could be worked on and seen. Now, of course, private enterprise is very smart. If there's money to be made, they're going to move regardless of what all of us here think. But you have the problem of politics intruding. And we are not as Americans as in favor of free trade as we used to be. So that part of the alienation with Brazil is due to our closing of our markets to Brazil. So there is a lot to go on here on both sides, a lot of room for adjustment.
Well, last question to my dear friend Mark Lohr, retired American diplomat, formerly director of the Brazil and Southern Cone office at the State Department.
Long time ago.
But you still keep your interests.
I try to. Yes, I wanted to echo the kudos. I found this very interesting, and sort of living out in the Shenandoah Valley, it's a great way to sort of reinsert myself, at least for an afternoon, into these discussions. Professor Bethel reminded us about the way that Brazil, from its fledgling days on the world stage, the Pan American Movement, the Hague Conference, the War Alliances, League of Nations, becoming a founding member of the UN. It has engaged multilaterally and has used multilateral diplomacy in large part, in many cases, to deal with the United States, and as a way to filter and to protect itself at times. And that's understandable. It now wants to become a permanent member of the Security Council. It would seem to me that one of the things that Obama is likely to be very interested in and to want to talk to his Brazilian hosts about is how Brazil will engage itself on creating more of the kind of international infrastructure in various areas. Luigi, you referred to some things like women's rights, but there are legions of them. Arms control, nuclear issues, a lot of things that have lately been a source of tension. But Obama is famously known for wanting to see this kind of internationalist foreign policy and the emerging countries like the BRICS be members of this. He's been very frustrated with the Chinese, with the Russians. I think he'll try it out on the Brazilians. So I guess I'm just wondering to what degree, because if Brazil is going to do that, Brazil is going to have to use considerable resources to engage itself meaningfully in that way. So it's a question for both of you, given their background, but also given their pretensions, whether in fact will Obama be disappointed in that area, or is there a room for the two to work together on the international stage?
The U.S. is beginning to realize it can't do it all by itself. Brazil is probably beginning to realize that its ambitions bring costs with them. There is a tradition of Brazilian foreign policy that says that too much activism can lead to accidents of the road, and we're not wealthy enough. You guys maybe, but not us. I think we shouldn't underestimate how much Brazil is doing in Haiti. I think we should probably expect Brazil to want to do less in Haiti at some point. So there are a lot of points of very real difficulty here. And I am not suggesting, again, a strategic partnership. We're going to simply have to learn to consult to try to find those areas where we can make things work together.
Glass.
I think I can only add to that that it's the problem we've discussed all afternoon. as Brazil rises and begins to be more influential, both in, or want to be more influential, and actually is more influential in the region and the world, of course it comes up against the United States. The United States has been the hegemonic power in the region and in the world, in the region, well, for a century, and in the world for almost a century. So anything that Brazil does, it faces the regional structure and the global structure, which is, diplomats used to say, frozen in the Cold War. It has to be unfrozen, but how far is the United States willing to unfreeze to allow countries like Brazil? I think we should drop the BRICS. The BRICS really is now outmoded. It doesn't get us anywhere at all, but in terms of Brazil. Whereas, on the other hand, the United States, of course, has the same problem. Here it is, for the first time in its history, facing challenges from rising powers, but one of them is in the area that it always totally dominated. It's difficult enough facing what is happening with China or with India, but in Brazil it's particularly difficult because Brazil is the first and the only country in Latin America that could in any way challenge the total domination of the United States. So this creates all kinds of tensions. And since we're closing, I can't resist ending with an anecdote, which some of you know, but I imagine some don't. And it's relevant to many of the things we've talked about this afternoon, US-Brazil relations and the nature of Brazilian society. Paulo knows this, and some of you do. When President Cardoso made his first visit to Washington, to the President Bush, and the day after he arrived, they met in the morning, and it was a Monday morning. And President Bush said, well, what did you do yesterday in Washington? What was the program? And President Cardoso, he told me this story privately, and then he actually published it in his memoirs. He said, well, I went to the synagogue. And Bush looked really surprised. I mean, you came here and went to the synagogue. Why on earth would you do that? You're not Jewish. He said, no, but I have a lot of very powerful Jewish friends, and I'm a politician, and I'm from Sao Paulo, and there's a very large Jewish community, and I keep in touch with the Jewish. Don't you worry about that. He said, you know, Sao Paulo's like that. It's got, for example, you probably know, George, you probably know, that it has a huge Italian population. Yeah, and you do know that it has the largest Japanese population outside Japan. Yes, really. And it has, by the way, a huge Middle East, Lebanese, Syrian population. Really. And that's not even counting the blacks. And George Bush said, you got blacks in Brazil? I think President Obama's not likely to make that mistake.
With that, I would like to thank you very much for being here. I would like especially to thank Professor Leslie Bethel, Ambassador Luigi Einaudi, which I think deserve a round of applause. Well, our next program is Wednesday, March the 16th at 10 in the morning on the 5th floor. It is about a new approach to citizen security, the units of pacifying police in the city of Rio de Janeiro. The two principal officers in the Secretariat for Public Security in Rio will be here with us to present on that. You are very welcome to attend. Thank you very much.